Hello everyone, my name is Dr. John Gross and welcome back to another GIS lecture video. And in this lecture video I want to wrap up our discussion on the fundamentals of cartography by going through a sort of rudimentary map making workflow. And what I mean by that is we've already talked about the pieces of the map and the things we need to consider when we construct the layout, but I want to take a step back even from that and just go through, before you even put any map elements down, what kinds of things do we need to be thinking about? How can we structure our approach so that we're able to come out with a good map that is scientifically and cartographically accurate, and preferably not wasting too much time in the process. So let's go ahead and give ourselves a little bit of space here. And let's talk about a map making workflow. So I prefer to think about map making workflow as a series of steps. So the first step is going to be to think about what you're mapping. Right? So this is going to be things like, what size and shape is the study area? Right? Because this is going to influence things like, for example, if we're mapping a large area on a relatively small physical map, right, that's going to impact the potential scale that we can use. Right? The shape is going to impact whether we choose a landscape or a portrait. Right? So this has, right, this implies, right, scale, right? This is going to impact the final scale. Right? That relationship between the size of objects on the map and the size of objects in the real world, right? That's going to be driven by, right, the size of the study area relative to the size of the final map that we can make, right? The shape is going to impact, right, landscape versus portrait. Versus, right, other, right? Maybe we need to have some sort of a custom size map page, right? That's something to think about early on before we even start drawing out any sort of prototype, right? Right? What layers are we going to use? What data are we going to get? Right? If we're going to map demographics, or we want to map demographics, we're going to need demographic data, right? So thinking about what you need up front is going to make the process of making sure that you have everything that you need that much easier, so that you don't go into the mapping process and be like, oh, wait, this data set that I have doesn't actually have the data that I need, right? So this is going to be making sure that you get all the data you need. Right? Are you going to be making a reference map? What layers do you want to include? Making sure that you know what things you want to put if it's a thematic map, right? Do you want any ancillary data? Do you want other things in there to give reference and context, right? These are all things you should think about well before you ever open up ArcGIS Pro and start moving around north arrows. right? Think about sort of from a meta level, right? Think, are there, and this is going to play a little bit into the next point anyway, but right, are there social conventions connected to this topic? Right? So a good example of this would be if you were making a thematic map of GDP, for example, of all of the countries in the world, right? A social convention of that would be that money is typically associated with the color green, at least in the United States, and we'll talk about that in a minute too, right? But that there might be social conventions that are going to drive symbology, right? That as you're thinking about, what you're mapping, well, are there any social conventions I need to be aware of that might impact your symbology? Right? So the first step is to think about what you're mapping. The second step, and it's related, is to think about the audience. Right? And some key things to think about here are, number one, right? How familiar are they with the topic? Right? Because this is going to affect things like how specific is your legend? Right? Can you use acronyms, for example? Right? Do you need extra labels? Right? Kind of going off of this, right? Are they expecting are there certain symbologies that they might be expecting? This has a little bit more room here, right? They might be expecting. Right? Another question is to think about is, does your audience have any, do you have to do anything unique for that specific audience? Right? Are there any unique constraints for that audience? Right? And so what I mean by that is, think about your audience from the concept of, okay, do you know for a fact that there is a large portion of the population that might be colorblind? Now, as a general rule, you should plan for colorblind friendliness anyway. But if you know for a fact that you're dealing with a colorblind audience, make sure that you're handling like their unique medical situations, medical limitations. Right? But more importantly, right? Well, I shouldn't say more importantly, but another thing that you might not necessarily think about is think about technological limitations, right? Are you making this map digitally and exporting it as a PDF only to have them print it out because they prefer paper because they can't navigate technology well, right? That's a thing that happens, right? You may be intending it to be produced in a digital format. They may end up putting it in a physical format. And sometimes that transition doesn't always go well. Or, for example, color versus black and white. You produce the map in color, they might end up printing it in black and white, right? So no technological constraints. Right? I've had plenty of maps that I've made in color be reproduced in black and white, and they're much harder to interpret because I didn't account for that in advance. Right? So think about what you're mapping, think about your audience. 3, it's going to be gather and clean your data. Right? The big thing here is make sure that everything is in the same coordinate system. And in fact, this gets a yellow star. Make sure everything is in the same coordinate system. I know certain software like Arcgis Pro does a pretty good job of projecting on the fly, which is where the software handles internal projections, but still, it is always a very important idea to just make sure that when you're doing any mapping, that if you have more than one data set, everything's in the same projection from the start. That's just going to save you all kinds of potential hassles and things that you may not have thought could happen from happening. So once you have your map, you've got your data, right? Step 4 is going to be draft and critique. Right? Make a draft. How does it look? Right? Do you have a good visual hierarchy? Are your colors and everything appropriate? Are you meeting those constraints from your audience? Do you have good balance? Right? Make a draft. Even if it's a bad draft, make a draft and then critique it, right? And be honest. Be critical of yourself and be honest with yourself. And this is something that I do, is don't just critique it yourself, right? Let other people critique it as well. Right? Now you need to be careful about who you choose to critique it, right? I wouldn't let my boss, if it was depending on the relationship, right? You might not want your boss to critique your map, just like you might not necessarily want your mother to critique your map. But if you have trusted sources that are knowledgeable in the subject matter, let them critique it. Or if maybe the person is part of your potential audience, let them critique it, right? So you don't always necessarily have to do this critiquing just by yourself. And then finally, step 5, right? Publish. Right? Take all of that energy and effort and lessons that came from the drafting, finalize the map, and publish it. Whether it's in a digital format, whether it's in a printed format in a textbook, finish it up, finalize it, put the stamp on it, and send it out into the world. Okay? So I think just from the number of subtopics here, hopefully you got the sense that the first 2 steps are really the most important, right? Thinking about what you're going to map, how you're going to map it, and thinking about the audience and the limitations that they might put on the map so that you don't go into the drafting process just completely unaware and have to do more drafts than necessary, right? Because you may make 5 or 6 drafts before you realize, oh, wait, they actually needed it to be this way, right? If you think that through in the beginning, it'll save you time in the end. So hopefully this all makes sense. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.